Before we open it up, I just want to ask one question that relates specifically to the events of this week. General Barno, as you know, given what's happening today at The Hague, or has already happened, and what will be happening at the NATO summit later this week, there will be much discussion about the contributions from our allies to Afghanistan, and civilian resources, troops, equipment, funding. And as John Nagel said earlier this morning, the optics of 41 nations involved in Afghanistan is extremely important on the ground, and it's extremely important globally. And on the other hand, you talk to folks on our side who are serving over there, and they continually speak to the dysfunctionality, some of what Ashley talked about, the problems with the chain of command and the unity of command, and unity of decision-making, both within the military but also between the military and the civilian side. NATO still does not include the word war in its plans in describing the mission in Afghanistan. While a number of our allies have performed well over there, even the Brits and the Canadians still have to check with their capitals before conducting any major operation that we initiate or we are calling for. So on the one hand, we want their participation, their contribution, and all this equipment and resources and people. On the other hand, we have to sort of strike a balance between that and the risk of incoherence and dysfunctionality. How would you strike that balance? And we talk a lot about the need to bring everybody together under one command. It hasn't truly happened operationally. And what would you advise the administration in the days ahead to deliver on that?
I think that's a key question on the military side. Arguably, the NATO assumption of the overall military mission in Afghanistan that occurred about a year after I left, has been very problematic in terms of its execution. NATO, when I first arrived in Afghanistan in October '03, was about a 6,000, 7,000 soldier force in Kabul, in the municipal areas, devoted to essentially security of the capital. And over a period of time, they began a push that the U.S. obviously supported to move into other parts of the country very slowly based on conditions out there. NATO was originally enlisted to come to Afghanistan, broadly speaking, because it was moving to a security place that was very calm. And by the time I left there, I can recall in the spring of 2005, we had actually, one of our tactical headquarters had built a chart that said, how do you know your enemy is defeated? And they had checked off half the blocks on that chart by the spring of '05. We had a month in early '05 where, as I recall, there were no violent incidents related to the Taliban. The numbers were just flat. And the election essentially took all the air out of the balloon, which was part of our strategy in '04. And that, year and a half later was dramatically different. So in part that many would argue the change occurred because as the U.S. announced it was transitioning into NATO, and then the U.S. also announced in late '05 we were withdrawing 2,500 combat troops, we sent the message that we were on the way out of Afghanistan. And that changed the calculus of many of the players. So fast forward to today, we now have this essentially NATO structure that was originally brought in to do more of a peacekeeping mission, involved eyeball deep in a very tough counterinsurgency war, especially in the southern half of the country. The northern half of the country is still in effect a peacekeeping area. There's very little in the way of violent incidents right there now. And so the structure in the north is probably about right in my judgment. In the south, though, I think as we bring in 17,000 plus American troops and the 4,000 trainers, and potentially, as many of the speakers have noted, that's a down payment on future force. We need to amp up and perhaps change the headquarters arrangements to accommodate the fact we're now going to have, instead of 2 or 3 or 4 brigades on the ground, we may have 6 or 7 or more brigades there. That eventually gets us to, instead of having one 4-star headquarters in Kabul with just the regional commands, I think that we have to look at whether, as the U.S. reasserts leadership now in this mission, that we need to bring in some American division headquarters beyond the one that's there today, and perhaps even an American Corps headquarters, a 3-star headquarters, to help focus on this counterinsurgency fight in the southern part of the country. That's been in the debate mix for a while. I'm not sure we're going to be moving in that direction anytime soon, but I think that would be a very useful addition.
Fred, go ahead.
I'd like to second that and say I think that it's not only a useful but an essential addition. I don't think we're going to be able to develop and execute a proper campaign strategy without adding a 3-star headquarters to this fight as quickly as possible. And I'd just like to make a point about 2 quick points about alliances. First of all, when we NATOized the Afghan mission, the primary beneficiary of that was meant to be NATO. we need to remember that that was back in the day when we were looking for ways of justifying the alliance's continued existence. And also the center of gravity of NATO has shifted to Europe for anyone who's been following the Georgia-Russia conflict, and I think the future of the alliance is no longer going to be determined in Afghanistan, frankly, unless perhaps if we lose. But I want to make one last point, so I would say we have to stop imagining that the purpose of the alliance in Afghanistan is the alliance. The purpose of the alliance in Afghanistan is supporting the military effort, and it has to be focused on that. I've been cudgeling my brain to think of another example of an actual alliance-based counterinsurgency in history. And the only one I can really think of is the Boxer Rebellion. There's probably another one or two out there, but it's really hard. Alliance warfare is always hard. Alliance counterinsurgency is not only hard, but extremely rare. Usually what happens when you have multiple states involved in a counterinsurgency is that one of them is the dominant state and the others follow the lead, which is not always the case in coalition warfare. Wasn't the case in the Boxer Rebellion. I don't think this is the Boxer Rebellion. So I think that there's a real question here about how we're going to make this work in an alliance context, given that there's very little historical predicate or precedent for even thinking about how to do this.
One more question before I open it up. Jackson earlier today talked about the concerns abroad about the true bipartisan commitment to what we're doing in Afghanistan. And while there are concerns, and certainly the folks up here have talked about outside of this conference, is the concern that what you're seeing right now are some people on the right side of the political spectrum in Republican and conservative circles basically saying it's time to get out of the nation-building business. This is Obama's war. He campaigned in the summer and fall on Afghanistan, the importance of making Afghanistan the centerpiece of our global war on terror, or OCA, whatever we call it now, OCO, and that we made good on our war. We turned Iraq around and let Obama own Afghanistan. And of course, there's some on the left that are beginning to say, let's just get out of the war business altogether. And yet, as we've seen, as Bob alluded to, as we've seen, throughout recent history, once a president commits to a major military commitment, unlike in domestic policy, it is very hard for the Congress to unwind that. Certainly Republicans, once President Clinton committed to the Balkans, it was very hard for congressional Republicans, despite their opposition, to unwind it. As we saw with some of the debates over Iraq over the last couple of years, once the president had committed, it was very hard for his critics to unwind it on Capitol Hill. At the end of the day, President Obama has committed to Afghanistan in a major way. And despite there being growing opposition to it, don't you think just the logistical and resource commitments involved, you just can't unwind that kind of commitment quickly?
Well, I think you can't, and I think in particular, I think one of the biggest problems is that there does appear to be a powerful lobby within the Democrats on Congress against this policy. But I think they're going to discover something very quickly, if they haven't already, namely that a Democratic Congress cannot run against a Democratic president. And they cannot play the same kind of games that they played against Bush. So I think the danger is actually more subtle and more complicated. And I think we're starting to see it play out. I think there is pressure from certain congressional leaders on the Democratic caucus to press the administration to change its goals. And I think that the danger is that whereas President Bush was well known for being extremely stubborn and unswayable once he had committed to a policy.
Principled.
Yes. I was trying to look for value neutral words.
Yes, I know.
On the other side. It's less clear that President Obama will have that same degree of determination. Perhaps he will. He's just an unknown quantity in that regard. And so my concern is not that Congress is going to try to turn off this war. Nancy Pelosi cannot vote against President Obama's supplements. But that rather that they will put pressure and try to convince the president that he's losing support and therefore that the war is unsustainable, and therefore try to sway him and work with those within the administration who disagree with this policy to undermine it from within. And in that sense, vociferous Republican opposition would help them make that case to weaken the policy, which is why I think it's very important that we maintain a very strong bipartisan support for this effort so we can just take that issue off the table.
Open it up for questions. Go ahead, Megan.
Hi, just a quick question about the drug trade. From some of the articles that I read here, it sounds like the drug trade is this great undermining effort that's really going to destroy all of our efforts in Afghanistan. First of all, is that assumption correct? Secondly, I'd just like a little clarification of exactly who this poppy money goes to. I understand that some in Iran and some in the Afghan government benefit. Does it make it to Mullah Omar, Batullah Masood, the Haqqani network? Who exactly is getting this funds? And finally, how do we reconcile the problem that this money is directly funding our enemies, but at the same time, if we destroy this crop, we alienate the population? So how do we reconcile that? What is Obama's policy, and what is your suggestion?
I'm glad you brought that up. It's a very important question. I wish that we had the answer to where does all the drug money go, but unfortunately it's sort of a cash and carry kind of business, so it's rather hard to track receipts and figure that kind of thing out. In general terms, the sort of accepted statistics are that it's about a $4 billion a year business in Afghanistan. Estimates range from $100 million to $500 million of that goes to the Taliban, goes to the enemy, but principally I think to Mullah Omar's group and to the Haqqani network. I tend to think that it's probably at the higher end of that range, closer to 500 million. It's hard to know what they get from other sources. They certainly get significant funding from certain Saudi individuals, not the Saudi government, but certain Saudi individuals. They certainly get support from Pakistan and from other groups. Could they survive without any of the drug money? Probably not. But the question is, how much of that drug money could you take away in what kind of time period? And when I was there, we got an interesting briefing from the guys who do the poppy eradication. And it became clear that you can take maybe $20 to $30 million off of the street in terms of poppy production in a year. Okay, well, the problem is that they don't know when the poppy eradication guys go out, they don't know whether the field that they're cutting down belongs to somebody who's going to give the money to Mullah Omar or belongs to somebody who's going to give the money to someone in the Afghan government. And so if they were actually attacking specifically the $100 million a year, you might imagine that over time they might make some progress. But what they're actually attacking is the $4 billion a year at $20 million a year in eradication. In that sense, eradication is irrelevant to the counterinsurgency mission, simply because you're not going to be able to take enough money out of the pockets of the enemy in any period of time that matters. And so we should not imagine that that's part of the COIN effort. It's part of the long-term effort to build a stable Afghanistan, of course, and we should not give up on counter-narcotics, but we should separate it from the notion that it's part of the counterinsurgency fight, except in one respect. One of the most important things that is delegitimizing the current Afghan government in the eyes of its people is the belief that has considerable justification that the government is pervasively corrupt with drug money. A large portion of that $4 billion goes to people in the Afghan government. Portions of it also go to the Iranian Quds Force, portions of it go elsewhere, but a large portion goes to the Afghan government. I would submit to you that we would make much more of a dent in helping establish the legitimacy of the Afghan government by persuading the Afghan government to prosecute even a small number of senior Afghan leaders who have their hands all over this drug money. And it doesn't have to be Karzai's brother. We can start with other people. But get them to do that. And I think one or two even high-profile prosecutions and convictions would be worth more than $20 million worth of poppy eradication. How can we do this? Well, one of the things that we can do is recognize that in contrast to the kinds of criminality we saw in Iraq, drug trafficking is an international crime. And we can build evidence packets against Afghan narco-traffickers, including people in the government. And we can threaten the Afghan government. We can bring those people up on charges ourselves. We can bring it up in front of Interpol. Now, none of that's a good solution, because what you want is the Afghans to prosecute their own people. But we have leverage here that we're not using. And that's partly because we're so focused on killing poppies that we're not focused on what the actual problem is that's undermining our effort in the most fundamental sense. It's not the enemy, it's what it's doing in the Afghan government.
Yes, sir. Right there. Right, yeah, we need a mic right over there. Thanks.
Hi, Matt Duss, Center for American Progress. In regard to Dr. Kagan's point about maintaining bipartisan foreign policy consensus, there seems to be something of an agreement on the two panels today that however President Obama's plan is being spun, it is in fact a long-term, large-scale commitment to nation building in Afghanistan. Now, understanding that one of the reasons that the American public kind of soured on the Iraq effort was that there was this perception that President Bush was not being completely candid and forthright in describing the situation on the ground there for a number of years. How will it be possible for President Obama to maintain public support for the effort in Afghanistan without being completely candid about what he's trying to do there?
I think there are two ways to deal with that. One is the approach that seems to be embodied in the current policy, which is to convert the entire effort to the struggle to defeat Al-Qaeda and its constituents, and hope that that carries you through the process while you conduct nation building, as it were, covertly. The other is to come out at some point and be candid that this is ultimately a state and nation building effort, and that we have to be committed both in terms of resourcing it as well as staying the course over the long term. I'm not sure in my own mind about which of the two is better today. I think because of the issues that Dan raised about getting the Europeans on board, particularly in the next few months, the idea of focusing on Al-Qaeda may be a better tactic. But I think I agree with you that over the long term, there is no way you can sustain a policy like this based on a lie, or based simply on the expectation that people will buy into the anti-Al-Qaeda justification for sustaining such a long-term effort. So I hope that as the process evolves, the president will find opportunities to tell people clearly what this is about. Now, you have to remember part of the partisan politics that's involved here. Admitting that this is ultimately a state and nation building project implicitly involves admitting that there is a residual Bush legacy that was actually correct. And I can understand that this may not be palatable to announce, certainly in the immediate aftermath of an election. But if that is what the truth requires, then at some point we'll have to face up to it.
Let me come briefly to the president's defense. Obama has not been dishonest with the American people. He's been less than forthcoming about what the full costs and commitments, but I think we have to take the political environment into account. I don't think any American imagines that we're going to wrap this up in a short period of time. And President Obama gave no indication that he thought that we were going to wrap this up in a short period of time. And so I don't think there's an implicit promise out there in the president's current stated strategy that this is going to be a short-term thing, that it's not going to require a significant commitment, that it's going to be easy, so and so forth and so on. I think that I would have preferred to see a more straightforward exposition of how significant the commitment is going to be, how we have to be committed over the long term, and so forth. But I don't think that we're right now in a position where the president has implicitly promised one thing and is going to deliver something else. I think it's simply a question that he hasn't emphasized as much as some of us might like the magnitude and length of this effort. So I think the risk of people waking up a year from now and saying, hey, I thought that you said this was going to be done by now, and what's going on with this is very low. But I think at some point, Ashley is right, he's going to have to convert this into an argument for, no, this is really a defining struggle of our time, and it's something that's going to require our effort over a long period. But I agree that I don't think it was vital for him to do that just at this moment.
Yes, sir. Go ahead. Sorry to make you run all over the room.
Hi, I'm Christian Lowe with military.com. Fred, I'd like to see if you can burrow into the details a little bit on the commitment, the military commitment that's needed in Afghanistan. You helped craft a pretty detailed plan for the surge in Iraq. I'd also like to get the perspective of Lieutenant General Barno here. What specifically would you do with the increase in U.S. forces besides the training? The terrain in Afghanistan is a lot different. It's harder to secure. It's harder to resupply. It's harder to provide fire support. It's harder to do airstrikes. it presents a tactical challenge that Iraq did not. Can you give some suggestions on how we could craft a strategy that would work there?
Well, I'd love to burrow into the details, Christian. Thank you. That's what I really like to do. Iraq presented some challenges that Afghanistan doesn't either. The Iraqi insurgent penchant for fighting within populations made the task of rooting them out a lot harder. Afghan insurgents don't tend to do that on the whole. They tend to prefer to fight outside of population centers, which makes targeting them easier in some respects. So there are some trade-offs there, although in general terms I think you're right. Look, we will be up to 7 American combat brigades deployed in Afghanistan by the end of this year with all of the things that the President has committed. We were at 22 in Iraq at the height of the surge. My own estimate is that we are insufficiently focused on some of the gaps in our deployment pattern, particularly in RC West. I think that the provinces of Farah, Herat, Badghis, and Ghor are likely to become increasing flashpoints as we succeed in RC South and we drive some of the leadership at poppy cultivation and a variety of things into those provinces, which right now are very close to being devoid of any coalition forces and even Afghan forces, which is even more distressing. There are virtually no effective Afghan National Army troops in RC West right now. And in Badghis and Ghor, I don't think we even have PRTs, frankly. So that's sort of a black hole. I look at that and I think there's probably a requirement for 2 to 3 additional American combat brigades. I'd love for them not to be American, but I think they'll have to be American. And there's also the question of maintaining a theater reserve, which is something that we've never had in Afghanistan. We had sporadically in Iraq, and it turns out to be very important. So I think that you're looking at a requirement, a real requirement of 10, possibly 11 American brigades in a surge, I'll call it that would probably need to last 18 to 24 months, assuming, and this is the key thing, that we actually accelerate the development of the Afghan National Army. If we don't accelerate the development of the Afghan National Army, then we're going to have to be there in much more greater strength for a lot longer. Because right now, we're programmed to get to 134,000 in the ANA by the end of 2011. And that was already an acceleration. Originally, it was supposed to happen by 2013. 134,000 is totally inadequate in that country. I think 250,000 would be a minimum for the Afghan National Army, and we have to work on the Afghan police and border police. If we accelerate that, which is not a part of the current plan, unfortunately, then I could imagine a requirement for 10 or 11 American brigades for that period and then starting to ramp down. What do? Well, they're going to have to secure the population, and that means that they're going to have to do a lot of traditional counterinsurgency missions of identifying enemy sanctuary and support zones within Afghanistan, going to clear them out. Our guys are after this in some areas, in other areas they're not. The terrain and so forth makes it more complicated to do. Afghan culture makes it more complicated to do. You don't just drive into an Afghan village and set up a checkpoint the way we would do in Iraq. If you do that, you're likely to generate more violence rather than improving the situation. So cultural sensitivity is important. We'll have to work on that. And we're going to have to find a way to get the non-military components of this coordinated with the military effort, or even with each other, which right now is not happening. They are not coordinated with each other, and they're certainly not coordinated with the military effort. But in order for that to happen, you have to have a coherent and comprehensive military campaign plan into which these things can fit, or a joint campaign plan built jointly between the embassy, well, in that Iraq it was the embassy, you don't even have the equivalent of that in Afghanistan, built between the non-kinetic components and the military. None of that has happened, and I would submit that with the current state of the headquarters, both on the military side and on the civilian side over there isn't the capacity to do that kind of planning right now. And that's one of the reasons why I think that actually fixing the headquarters problem, including getting a 3-star headquarters over there, but also supporting McKiernan's efforts to build up the U.S. Forces Afghanistan staff. But somebody's got to figure out how to do that on the civilian side. I hope that that's what Holbrooke is taking on, but it's a big task, and he doesn't have an international mandate to do that. And then you have to do the planning, and that's one of the reasons this is going to take a long time, because right now we're flowing forces into theater. Those guys will get on the ground and do good things. They're not going to be counterproductive, but neither are they going to be used optimally or anything like optimally, because we simply don't have the planning structures in place to figure out how to do that. So if I were, the thing that distresses me most about the strategy other than the ANA is that the lack of urgency about fixing the command and control arrangements on both the civil and the military side so that we can do the planning we need to do.
Yeah, quick comment. I think when the military does their analysis on what they require in the way of forces, they do what's called troops to task. They identify what are the tasks you're trying to accomplish, then back off of that to say, here's what kind of a unit, here's how many I need to do that. In Afghanistan, there's a myriad of tasks out there, and again, these plans may exist. They haven't been made public at this point, but there's some fundamental questions. What's our strategy for dealing with population security in the rural areas? Vast majority of the country is rural. The majority of the population lives outside cities. What's our plan for how we're going to approach that, and then what's that imply in the way of troops? How are we going to use special operations forces? Are we going to use them primarily in strike missions? Are they going to train Afghan National Army units, commando units? Are they going to organize local protection forces in various parts of the country? Are they going to have a role on the border? Are they going to be in the interior? How are we thinking about that? What's the type of forces we'll need for lines of communication security? How do we make sure we can use the roads and the Afghan population can use the road, which is their lifeline as well? And how do we protect that? What kind of forces will be needed for that? What are we going to do along the borders? Are we going to provide any military capability there? You know, that's a 1,500-mile border with Pakistan, the distance from Washington, D.C. to Denver, Colorado, much of it looking like the Rocky Mountains. That's a daunting task, but are there some focused areas that there may be some military requirements? So all that goes into this calculus of what do you need in the way of troops and what kind of a approach you have. Each of those things I described has several options associated with it. And so you have to rationalize all those and come up with a comprehensive, as Fred notes, a joint campaign plan, and that's just the military. But the joint campaign plan, the civil military aspect. The one principle I think that's essential that I'm hopeful that we'll see laid out on the ground, that we started when I was there, and we do it in parts of the country but not in other parts, is what I call area ownership, which is military units own, from the standpoint of responsibility, pieces of territory, whether they be provinces or districts or multiple districts, and within that, the military commander, and this is primarily in the East today, has overall cognizance of all the effort that's going on. He doesn't command civilians, but the civilians work in support of his unified civil-military vision for that area. It's a collaborative effort, but the military guy effectively is held accountable for that territory, and he's partnered with an Afghan governmental official and usually Afghan military official as well. Again, we've got examples of this in the East. This is not how we operate in the South right now. And I think that idea of area ownership, of having one person in charge, or at most two people in charge, military and civilian, and having accountability for the results in a defined area that they're going to work for their entire tour is a very important principle that I hope becomes part of the operational plan on the ground.
Yeah. Okay, we have time for one more question. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Joey Petrovich from Georgetown University. We talked a lot about the differences between Iraq and Afghanistan as conflicts. I think one of the important parts of Iraq was the Sunni tribal awakening. My question to the panel is, how does that sort of local engagement fit into our strategy in Afghanistan, and whether that's competing with building legitimacy of the Afghan central government?
It depends on whether you do it right or do it wrong. It's not going to look anything like the Anbar awakening. Afghanistan is very different in this regard. The tribal dynamics are very different. I think the tribes are not going to be very helpful in this regard. I think that whereas in Iraq you could go to tribes, in Afghanistan I think you have to work at the village level. You have to work at the community level. There is a program in place right now, the Afghan Provincial Protection Program, or something like that, the PPP, I always forget what it stands for, which is trying to do something like this, but I think it's a flawed concept because it's focused at the district level, and as soon as you get to the district level, you have tribal politics, which tend to make this stuff break down, and it also is very heavily dependent on central government involvement. Look, I think what we're going to have to do is address the fact that 30 years of war have destroyed social structure in local Afghan villages. So community elders are not in charge, some local mullahs have been driven off or radicalized, and people don't have a sense of trust in their neighbors that Afghans have traditionally had to protect them against outside threats. How do you deal with that? Our guys go out with Afghan National Security Forces counterparts and we help reassure the population, find out what the actual threat is, help them address it, and get to the grievance that is the number one grievance that you hear in rural Afghanistan, which is a sense of insecurity, which is pervasive even where the security is actually pretty good. And I think that goes to this social breakdown. So it's going to be a very different phenomenon, and I think it's not going to be the sort of thing which sort of expands across Afghanistan freely the way the Anbar Awakening sort of did in Iraq. It was a little more complicated than that. But I do think that the basic concept is that we have to build bottom up as well as building top down. But in this case, bottom up is helping villagers understand that the organs of security that the Afghan central government has to provide to them, working with us, can give them the thing that they want most, and that will in turn feed back to the notion of legitimacy. So I think it can be made to work properly.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. And thanks to General Barno, Fred Kagan, and Ashley Tellis